Erin McGurn is the co-founder and executive director of SCALEAfrica and a licensed architect. Erin seeks to use her talent to create spaces where lives can be transformed. We talk about her formative experiences working in sub-Saharan Africa. We discuss how to utilize principles of the natural environment to enhance a student's learning and the difficulties of convincing politicians that architecture matters. Erin also explains why cost per unit is the wrong measure of success and why she would rather design classrooms in Zambia than condos in California. Let's listen. We're here at CGI with Erin McGurn, and we're talking about failures from the field, trying to unearth some of those important stories of the roadblocks, the failures, the challenges that come along in doing the work that we're all so passionate about, that we feel aren't talked about enough. So, Erin, if you just want to start by introducing yourself, and then I'd love for us to just have a short discussion.
Absolutely. So yes, I'm Erin McGurn, and I'm the executive director of an organization called SCALEAfrica. I'm also a licensed architect. And really the mission of SCALEAfrica is to design, fund, and build school infrastructure, green school infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. We've concentrated primarily in Zambia, in a remote area and discrete area of Zambia, working with a number of schools in a finite space so that we can really begin to understand the communities that we're working with. And really the larger picture here is to build sustainably, because that does not happen in Africa generally, to build safely, to create jobs that are local jobs, and to use natural resources that can either be replenished or things that can be made in the community. So the buildings really become these sort of handcrafted projects that are really community built, not just we say they're community built. And then in the larger way, even beyond the building, is really about what happens in those spaces, that it's really not enough to just put up classrooms, to really try to understand the mechanics of the educational system in Zambia and how we can partner with teachers and governments to improve those conditions, because right now they're really struggling.
So you definitely have a very specific point of view on your mission, in the sense that you've already mentioned that you want green buildings, that you want it sustainable. What experiences or observations brought you to the conclusion that these things are necessary to create what you want to create in the world?
Unfortunately, the sustainable piece came out of visiting a lot of schools in various countries, not just Zambia, and seeing that they were all built precisely the same, which was poorly. They were poorly lit, they were poorly ventilated, they were overcrowded. They didn't really support teachers interacting with students in a way that was going to meaningfully move the needle on their educational outcomes. And it was across the board. I could be in any country at any time of day, and the same things were going on in the classroom. And it struck me that some of the design issues that those buildings have were really not that difficult to solve. Sometimes it's something as simple as lowering the window in the wall so it's not tucked up under the eave, that you can actually get light. Definitely ventilating the roof and securing the roof in a different way so they're not peeling off. These are really simple things that architects, you don't even really need an architect for that. You need someone with an understanding of sort of principles of the natural environment. And that struck me as something sort of easy to do. Once we got deeper into it, we realized that what's not easy to do is to work with communities and governments to help them understand why that matters, and to make adjustments on something that they're quite comfortable doing, sort of, but why would we do this? The kids are fine. We have a school. They were so happy to have a school that they didn't really, it wasn't on their priority list to make some adaptations that would meaningfully change the interior environment of the classroom.
So you mentioned a number of stakeholders in your description of how you need to work with the community. I can imagine that in diving in there, you may have dealt with opposing priorities and opposing points of view on what you would. How have you dealt with that? What obstacles have you faced? What frustrations have you faced, and how have you dealt with it?
Yeah, I see them both as frustrations and also learning opportunities. In the moment, they're frustrating, and then later you kind of come to some realization. So when we went to Zambia to work on the first project, it was really because we had engaged a school, and we're really just writing letters back and forth with them, and we got a note from the head teacher saying that the roof had peeled off. So that was one of those, we can fix this, right? But this is a school with 1,000 kids and 4 classrooms, so the issue was not just the roof, it was really spatial needs in general. And we thought, if we're going to re-engage, let's design a classroom building. And if we're going to do one, let's do a 1x4, 4 classrooms, because to activate this whole process and only do 2 is a failure of the use of the resources that we have. So they don't really have designs for 1x4s. They have 1x1s, 2s, and 3s. And so what I presented them was automatically different. And we had to go through a series of conversations about why architecture mattered and come to compromise about things that I thought weren't going to make the building perfect, but were going to make the building better. And that this was an evolution. And because I had a longer term arc in my mind about this relationship, I didn't need to solve it right then. So there are a number of design compromises in the building that I don't necessarily agree with, but it was what the community wanted, and it helped them get comfortable with us and what those principles that I was trying to lay out for them meant, and to demonstrate it physically. It worked beautifully. Everyone's like, how did you do it? I said, it's just math. It's actually just a math problem about moving those things around. And once it was demonstrated, we got to the next building, it was almost like carte blanche. It was sort of like, oh, if we trust you now. It was a trust building exercise, that very first building.
So with all the features you've described, the green elements and kind of the design features that would make it most amenable for the community, I can imagine that there's a dialogue out there. We see other organizations building classrooms and schools very simply. When you engage in that dialogue over whether to choose what seems to be your approach, which is a more detailed approach into providing maybe a higher quality product as opposed to just rolling out more, how do you engage in that debate?
I have had this conversation so many times, and particularly with foundations, I have to say, which is, why would you spend $70,000 on a classroom building when you can do 4 for 15? And, well, the math wasn't correct, but you know what I'm saying, 5. And it sounds so simple. Oh, yeah, of course I would do that. But unfortunately, the $15,000 option is going to fail. It will fail. It won't be built properly. It can't possibly be. The material qualities will be incredibly poor. And it simply won't last, and you'll be back where you started, with classrooms crumbling around kids' heads, squeezing them into the ones that are fine, and having the overcrowding and the health conditions that come from that, and the lack of learning. So the investment is really, again, on the we're just basically thinking longer term, and the life cycle of the building and the communities they work with are 20, 30 years out, not can we just deliver a box today. I can do that, but that's not really the longer term objective.
So, as somebody who is an architect, how is it that you decided to take this path toward trying to make change in these communities that are not your own, that are far away from where you came from? How did you get involved in this, and what kind of milestones drove you to your particular approach and your particular projects you're working on now?
Well, my husband's originally from Zimbabwe, and so he has a number, he sells a lot of, not in Zimbabwe, but in South Africa. And we were really just traveling around. And at the time, and this was in 2006, visiting family and then going out into the bush and villages and things. And the first trip to Africa, I realized I didn't meet any Africans. So the second trip, we were like, let's go visit some schools and clinics and just really meet people. And that's why we like to travel, is meeting people. That's the best part of travel, I think. So that first school that we visited really was the catalyst, but I wasn't looking for a project. At the time, I was doing very high-end residential in California for a lot of VCs, and it was sort of post-tech boom, but those people had made their money, so it didn't really affect them. And we just kept plowing through, doing really beautiful work. But at some point, I began to question the value of all of these resources and time and energy and money for projects that were going to benefit just a few people. And when I saw the needs that are there in places like Zambia, that with the kind of money we were spending on door hardware, that we could build whole classrooms and that we could work with whole communities. And once I started to quantify it that way in my head, it was really hard to walk away and not want to, at least on a part-time basis, direct some of my efforts that way. And the way that I've really described it is there's the architecture of want, and then there's the architecture of need. And I try to balance those things in my practice. I still do the architecture of want because it keeps our business going, but I'm really very passionate about the architecture of need. And that's really sort of mentally how that split happened, and then sort of the evolution of the founding of SCALEAfrica and then my architecture firm Scale Studio.
So you described kind of why the architecture of want is not kind of completely fulfilling to your personal goals and to the goals of what you want to accomplish in the world. But what is the most frustrating part of doing the architecture of need? What is the hardest part?
You never have enough money. I mean, I think we talk about that in our office all the time, that if we had more money, we would be crushing it. That it's not about our capacity or vision or direction, and it's all about the bank account. And it's very hard to convince, it's not hard to convince our private donors why we do what we do, because I think it's such a personal thing for us and they know us directly. But to go to outside funders and explain why buildings are necessary is really challenging. It's not particularly sexy. And I think that what I hear or the feedback that I get is that we want to focus on programs and not people. People and not buildings, just programs. And I don't think that you can have a program without a suitable place to host it. And that those things, you can't just pull those two pieces apart and think that they're separate. They're really instrumental. And if we think about the quality of space impacting the quality of programs, it's so obvious, but it's but it's really hard to make that argument when foundations have their particular, sort of things they give to and things they have decided they don't give to. And for a small organization, it's hard to advocate for why that mindset should change.
Erin, thank you very much for joining me. This was excellent, and I really appreciate your insights.